Good morning. My name is Jamison Steeve. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity. I'd like to welcome you to the Rotman School and the release of our 12th annual report. As you can see, course correction, charting a new course, a new roadmap for Ontario. I want to welcome you this morning. We have a jam-packed hour of economic analysis, public policy, and provocation, which explains why we have a full house. I have a couple duties here this morning. So just so you know our agenda today, a brief introduction by myself, about a 30-minute presentation from Roger, and then we'll have a bit of in-conversation in our comfy chairs between John Manley and Roger Martin, and then I'll leave 10 minutes at the end for some Q&A from the audience. We've had a busy fall at the Institute. We have reinvigorated our website. We've put out new papers on precarious employment, a fairly provocative paper on tax reform that's gotten a lot of attention both at Queen's Park and in the media, and now a pretty comprehensive and in-depth report on Ontario's economy here with our annual report. With that, I'd want to thank a couple folks. There are great scenes in Star Trek movies where the captain yells, "I want to go faster, I want to go faster," and Scotty yells from, I can't make it go any faster, Captain." My Scotty is the equivalent of the team at the back. I want to thank all of the researchers at ICP who are listed in the report, as well as the good people at Hambly Woolly who took a white paper and turned it into a kapow paper today with some pretty great graphics, as well as our editor, Diane Nellis. Today we're joined by John Manley. John is not a stranger to any of you, who's added so much to public life here in Canada. His current role is President and CEO of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, the senior voice of Canadian business leaders. He has an opportunity to speak later on today as well, and he's taken some of his time to make sure that we drive some messages home here today along with Roger. With that, I'd like to introduce Roger Martin. There's so many ways with which I could introduce Roger, but quite frankly, just a builder of the public good is how I would describe him, both in his past career and where he is going. So it's my honor to work with him. And with that, I'll turn it over to Roger Martin.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the intro. Thanks for being here. And I'm going to be very quick to make sure that I finish by 9:30 because we've got an old friend and important Canadian here, John Manley, to talk with afterwards. So I will just try and hit the highlights of this annual report, 12th annual report of the Ontario Task Force on Competitiveness, Productivity, and Economic Progress, and this is what we're supposed to do. That set out this in 2001, and I have a great task force that has helped all along the way on the work that we've done. So Ontario has got a competitiveness, innovation, productivity conundrum. We've been at this for a while. We've been comparing Ontario to peer jurisdictions. We started out comparing peer jurisdictions only in the U.S., but that expanded it more broadly. And this is the story against our 12 peers outside North America. We compared to 15 peers inside North America, 12 outside, so there's 28 of us, including Ontario, and we are sixth against those peers. And guess what? In 2001, we were sixth as well, and we were 14th against our peer jurisdictions in the U.S. and Canada, and these were just the jurisdictions that are half as big as Ontario or bigger in 2001 when we started, and we just kept these peers the same. What this means is that we are 19th out of 28th. We were in 2001, and we still are. So we have not made progress against the original goal, which was to get to the median of these U.S. Jurisdictions. This is kind of the scoop, and it's always good to look back at history a little bit. And one of the things to note is that Ontario's 1990s were pretty horrible, as it turns out. As you can see, we were quite close in terms of our prosperity gap with our peers back in 1989, when the green line, that green dotted line, which is the gap with the U.S. And the scale out on the right-hand side, it went sort of vertical for a decade, where we headed into a really bad recession, worse than the rest of our peers in the 90s, and got the gap up to over $10,000 in GDP per capita. Now, the good news, right, is from the height of that in 1999, we've sort of battled it back a little bit, but progress has been incredibly difficult against the peers because the peers keep moving forward, and so we've got to move forward faster than the peers to close that gap. That having been said, it just wasn't that long ago that there was almost no gap, and so I think it's important not to just kind of give up on that and say, boy, this is tough sledding. I think the province of Ontario deserves more than that, and because how Ontario goes has a super important impact on Canada. It's an important question for Canada as well. Now, in looking at the prosperity, we've long used this model where we break it into 4 pieces: our profile, our utilization, our intensity, and our productivity. And the story over the course of the 12 years has actually changed fairly dramatically in composition. If you think about the first 3 as work effort, it's just how much are Ontarians working. So how many of them can work, that's profile. How many of them kind of try to get a job, participation. How many of them who try to get a job, that's employment. And then if they're working at a job, how many hours a year do they work? And what you can see is that despite notions of, we have a social safety net so people don't want to work, don't seek employment, that's all just completely false. This is against those highly industrialized leading U.S. states. We have a similar work effort. We do it differently. We have more people working and each of them works less. But overall, our work effort is equivalent to the U.S. It's a rounding error difference. So, and this didn't used to be the case. When we were doing this work earlier on, we had a big work effort gap and a smaller productivity gap. What's happened is we've gotten the work effort up to our peers and have this gigantic productivity gap of $8,300 in GDP per capita. Now, the way to think about productivity, everybody thinks about productivity, I think, first on the right-hand side here of efficiency, right, is that we have to reduce costs to get our productivity up. I actually don't believe that, right? I believe that the big Ontario problem, the big Canada problem is now value added. It's the creation of unique products and services and features. It's actually innovation on the value side of the equation. And I think our prosperity in Canada and in Ontario is hampered dramatically by weaker innovation than our peers, and that's what we've got to work on. Now, the model we've always used to think about this is our AIMS model that says the combination of these sort of 4 things working in a circle: attitudes, structures, motivations, and investments. They either provide a vicious or virtuous circle. If you've got the right attitudes, you'll invest more. If you've got the right motivations, that'll also help your investments. You'll build structures that are good for productivity, upgrading, etc., or not. And what we would say is on the attitudes front, we need to make sure we're encouraging as ambitious actions from Ontario's business leaders as possible. And that's one of the things to talk with John about, who I know shares the same desire to make sure our businesses are as innovative and productive as they can possibly be. But one of the key things is just to make sure that we are continuing to aim high. Like, the easiest thing to do would be to say 14th is fine, and we'll keep this productivity gap. But if you think about it, a lot of our advance in the prosperity of Ontario has come from having the work effort get up to as high a level as the U.S., and now it's productivity that's the key to any further advance. As Paul Krugman famously said, productivity isn't everything, but in the long term, it's almost everything. And we're talking about the long term here. I would also say that I feel that it's absolutely critical to have this be a much more innovation-oriented province. I'm a proponent of teaching innovation at the K through 12 level so that we have every Ontario worker who enters the workforce, whether it's in government, in a healthcare system, in a business, is thinking about how we can make what we do more valuable for users. We don't do enough of that. We focus on a narrow part of the innovation spectrum, in my view, innovation in high-tech industries, innovation by way of entrepreneurship. But I can absolutely guarantee you that there is no way our high-tech industries are going to close that prosperity gap. I would argue that of that $8,000 prosperity gap, the most you can identify as a shortcoming of our high-tech industries is $50. It's not the answer, nor is entrepreneurship alone the answer. The answer is every person in every organization trying to figure out how to do things a little bit better and believing that that's key to prosperity for the future. That includes our business leaders, but it includes everybody in businesses, everybody in every kind of organization, including an organization like our own here. On investments, there's a few real investment challenges. So even with the right attitudes, if you don't have the investments behind those attitudes, you can't keep increasing your productivity and your competitiveness. And the picture here is not a terribly pleasant one. So if you just look at the productivity growth here in the manufacturing sector, what you see here is that Canada and Ontario mirrors Canada, but we've just got Canada versus the U.S. here. Is that whereas the U.S. you'll notice during that kind of the horrible decade for Ontario and Canada, U.S. productivity shot up in the mid 90s and stayed relatively high till the mid 2000s. Ours dropped off, stayed flat, and then has dropped off, and that's in the manufacturing sector. So it's just hard to have your productivity underpin your competitiveness and your prosperity with those kind of numbers. And of course, the world is changing, right? So that the non-manufacturing sector is getting ever more important, right? There's huge growth in non-manufacturing jobs and shrinking in manufacturing jobs, and this is the story in non-manufacturing labor productivity growth, right? Which is it's anemic. And this is why productivity growth, by the way, in North America is falling, right? Is that these numbers are higher than these numbers, and there's a mix shift heading towards non-manufacturing. And if you want to read about it, I wrote an HBR article in last month's issue about why that's a challenge, and we're doing very little about it. But making sure that we think about that productivity growth is key. And one thing that is linked to productivity is investment in information and communications technology. And here, unfortunately, our track record is not great. But it's a very interesting, I think, picture. It's not exactly what people think. When people wander around the offices of Canadian businesses, Ontario businesses, they say, wow, they've got as many computers on their desks as they do in the U.S. That's absolutely correct. And that's this chart right here, right? This one here, computer investment per worker, the same. And interesting enough, it has always been the same, or nearly the same, right? But look what's become much more important to the world. You see the scale. That the middle bottom one goes up to 3,500 person worker. That one goes up to 1,600. The big thing, the big investment is software, and the gap is just going out of sight. I mean, that's getting absolutely worse and worse. The smallest of the three is communications equipment, right? But you can see that gap is getting worse and worse too. But this is a classic kind of Ontario/Canada story, which is on the basics. Do you have a PC on your desk? We got it. We got that covered. On the advanced aspect of it, the last dollar spent is going to be on software that makes that piece of hardware sitting on your desk actually do useful things for you to help you to compete more. There's where we're falling behind. We've got to figure out what is it about the ways our businesses are competing that cause them to believe that it is perfectly fine to invest a couple $1,000s per year per worker less than their U.S. peers in software that enhances their productivity. Right? There is no good answer. Right? The only answer is that they aren't as dedicated to productivity innovation as they need to be. and how we can change that is a big challenge. So that's one area of investment that's absolutely critical in productivity. Another area of human capital that we've taken a look at in this report is this question of skilled trades. And it turns out that, right, skilled trades is a big question for the economy. Skilled trades have a better employment record than all other occupations, although in 2009 you can see that that orange line went slightly above the blue line, but historically they do better, and there's shortages experienced by companies, or at least reported by companies, and the answer tends to be, hey, we got to have more apprenticeship programs. We probably do need more apprenticeship programs, but if you look at it objectively, that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is dropping out of apprenticeship programs. So these are apprenticeship programs across a variety of categories where folks who actually enter the apprenticeship program only have a 50% graduation rate from those apprenticeship programs. So we're kind of making an investment, right, an important one, having programs there that aren't being utilized to the extent that they could, and figuring out how to do this better. And, Alberta does a good job here. I don't ever like saying Alberta. No, I shouldn't say that. But I just was kidding there. But they've done a good job on actually making the blue lines higher, and making the gap between the blue lines and the green lines better. So there are things that Ontario can learn from the best practices in other jurisdictions to make sure we're investing the way we need there. And then the other one we just point out and talk about a little bit more, I won't go into detail here, is the real opportunity for Ontario now in the north. There's a real opportunity to invest to support the mining, minerals and mining sector in the north, making sure there's the right skilled personnel, there's the right infrastructure to take full advantage of that opportunity. So we have to make sure we're investing both in the information and communications technology that underpins productivity, the skills that underpin it, and the infrastructure that supports regions like the Northwest. The other thing, the next one is motivations. Do we have the motivations to invest and upgrade and innovate? And here there is a relatively happy story, which is the question of how smart is your taxation system. On that question, the best performing jurisdiction on the planet over the last little while is our own jurisdiction. So the way to think about this is the marginal effective tax rate on business and investment. And what you want to be is below the 45-degree line, which means that in 2005, your marginal effective tax rate on taking $1 of investment from your corporate treasury and investing it in something in the business was higher than it is today. Right? If you're on the high side of that line, it means your marginal effective tax rate on business investment is going up. Right? And what you can see, right, is a pattern of the world is figuring out in general that taxing businesses highly is really dumb because businesses are the places that create jobs and the like. You can figure out how to get your tax revenue from the people who benefit from having high-paid jobs or capital gains or the like, but taxing businesses to make sure they don't invest has not been a good idea, and the world has figured it out. So you can see a movement in that direction, but then it begs the question, so what is exemplary progress? Right? It's movement as far from that 45-degree line as possible. And the jurisdiction on the planet that's moved the farthest is Ontario. So we have done well in making our tax system or our tax structure smarter. And we've also Canada is as a national jurisdiction, Canada is the best performer over that 7-year period in making its tax structure smarter during that period. And Ontario had further to go and has gone farther, which is fantastic. So I think on that front, we've done a good job in this province of spurring greater motivation to invest, motivation to make our productivity higher. And so we just have to make sure that the institutions take advantage of this and not the other way, because we now have a very kind of good tax structure. Now, to be fair, we're about the middle of the pack, right? So where we are now versus all of the peers across the world is what's measured on the vertical axis, right? That's where we are in 2012. So we're not a low cost jurisdiction, but anybody who thinks from a business standpoint we're some kind of a high cost jurisdiction is just false, just absolutely false. And you'll notice who is the highest cost jurisdiction for doing business on the face of the planet. And for what it's worth, which is the United States of America, that low tax jurisdiction, I've always thought, right, that France has got the dumbest tax structure in the world, but actually it is not true. The U.S. has got arguably the dumbest tax structure in the world. And my biggest fear, for what it's worth, is that the United States does wake up because of the crisis down there and get smart, right? And what would be smart? A VAT. If the United States did a national VAT and slashed corporate tax by 2/3, which would be easily done, that would tilt the balance of investment dramatically in their favor and against us. So we were smarter to do a VAT sooner, but that's the threat. But you can see why the United States has sort of a kind of an investment and productivity challenge as well. The other two things, just on the tax front, we just want to keep getting smarter, and we advocate in the working paper to phase out some taxes that are just dumb, right? They do not do what they were set out to do. We've got all sorts of crazy little tax breaks that are designed to help poor people, that actually help wealthy people. And we've got some clever taxes that we should, and tax breaks that we should do more of. So one thing we call for is the phase out of the Canada Employment Tax Credit, which is just a silly sop to richer Canadians that does nothing useful for the economy, and use that phase out to fund a greater working income tax benefit, which is a program that we think actually does help exactly who we want to help. That is poor working mothers and fathers to enter the workforce and ramp up their work and get a better after-tax benefit from doing that. So we can continue to get smarter. And probably the single most unpopular thing we were saying in the report is that we should be thinking about a carbon tax. I mean, for me, this is one of these obvious things where, in due course, there will be one for everyone, and the countries that go to it latest will get the least benefit from it, and it'll be the most harmful for them. The ones that do it earlier will get the greatest benefit, and we're playing around with seeing how late we can do that, and I'm never a fan of not being smart. The other thing is we've got to think about the structures that underpin our competitiveness, and making sure that we support structures that help us. And one of the things that's really important is our clusters. And Ontario has lots and lots of clusters of industries that provide the agglomeration that makes them effective. We know some of the obvious ones: financial services in Toronto, and communication technology in Waterloo and Ottawa. But there are all sorts across the province: furniture in Barrie, lighting and electrical equipment in Peterborough, heavy machinery in Hamilton. Small electrical goods in Brantford. And it's really important that governments governments make sure that they are supporting those clusters. There is no evidence, right, that a government can say we would like to build a cluster somewhere. There just isn't any of it. There's been lots and lots of attempts to try to do that, and little evidence that it works. But there is increasing evidence that if governments see a cluster functioning and give it the supports it needs, specialized education, specialized infrastructure, specialized research, all of those things, we have to make sure that those clusters, which are the engine of our prosperity, prosper. One that we look at, I'll just spend a minute on, but one that we looked at in this year and talk about it in the report is the agri-food cluster. And again, this is one where it's a big and important one, and it doesn't do as well as it needs to. It's a lower value added than our peers. You can see it's below average. We're running a bigger and bigger trade deficit in this, Ontario. I mean, why is a question, and so we have some thoughts in the report on that cluster, and we should be thinking about making sure our other clusters do well as well. And since we're in Toronto, it behooves me to put the slide in about transit. I mean, we are incurring ever greater costs of the inadequacies of transit here in Toronto, and so however goes Toronto, so goes the province, and I think thinking in some structural way about solving this problem is important. I encourage you to read the report. It lays out this road to prosperity with, and I've highlighted maybe a third of these bubbles on this chart, but we think there's a comprehensive plan that governments, 4 different governments since we've started this, have actually been picking away at. I mean, I think governments have done a lot of good things that have helped put in place a framework for us succeeding to a greater extent than not. But I think now it is time to make sure it's not just government. Government can do more, but it's every Ontarian, Ontario businesses, Ontario educational institutions. Think about how it is we can invest to continuously innovate and upgrade. None of the peer jurisdictions are standing still. They're all moving forward in one way or another. And the question is, how can we move forward faster? And with that, I'd love to have a little conversation with John Manley, because John and I worked together when he was industry minister in Ottawa, and a bunch of good things. So he's been passionate about this for forever. I was thrilled, absolutely thrilled, when he took over the CCCE job, because I think it's a really important job for Canada, prosperity, competitiveness. And I was just asking him, how long has that been, John? And it's been 4 years now, so he's had some time to settle in there. And I know he's passionate about how to make Canadian businesses more competitive. So I thought we'd just have a little conversation on stage about what the CCCE is up to, what John is up to, and then we'll open it up for questions. So John, could you join me on stage?
Thanks, Roger.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about what are some of the things that you're focusing on at CCCE that sort of has come out of a combination of your long background on a bunch of these issues in government and the interests of your constituency there with all these senior executives.
First, maybe to place it, and congratulations on another great report. They're cumulative, and the effect, I think, is cumulative. But when I think back, it's actually 20 years since I became the industry minister.
Yep.
So November 4th, 1993, my associate deputy is somebody Kevin Lynch.
Yes.
And day one, I saw the first of what would become a lifetime of Kevin Lynch PowerPoint presentations on the productivity problem.
He gives good PowerPoint, Kevin does.
So we were talking about some of these same issues around productivity and how it relates to competitiveness 20 years ago. And I guess if we'd figured out how to solve it, we wouldn't still be talking about it today.
Yep.
But there are clearly a lot of complicating factors, a lot of moving parts in the whole conundrum, and it's hard to isolate some of them. I think when I think of those periods that you described as dark years in the 1990s, it was also a time when the Canadian dollar was trading at a very low level.
Yep.
So a lot of our, certainly in our manufacturing sector, we were able to do actually pretty well.
Yep.
With lagging levels of productivity, simply because we were underpaying ourselves. We were paying ourselves in 64-cent dollars, and it makes it a little easier to be competitive.
It sure does. I remember doing, because I was a strategy consultant in those days, doing a study of the uncoated free sheet market in Canada, but the photocopier paper, and we had all sorts of mills that had fantastic competitive position at that point. But if you just did a scenario that said instead of 62 cents, what if it was like 85 cents? Something that was almost like they could unimaginably high in those days. They all went from being highly competitive to completely uncompetitive. But it's sure hard in those days to put lots and lots of dollars into making yourself more competitive when you're when you're doing great. So I saw that in spades. Absolutely.
You couldn't make the business case.
Yep.
For if management went to a board of directors and said, well, we're going to make a business case here why we should invest in the latest high-tech equipment and raise our productivity rates, they wouldn't get a payoff on it.
Yep.
So they didn't do it.
Yep.
Which I think accounts for the fact that the firms that have succeeded over the long term, going back through all those years, tend to have had scale from the outset and be involved in international markets. And in fact, doing to some degree their own cost arbitrage internally as an enterprise. And, increasingly as I think about this, when I look at what we've got as issues in Canada, and I have to say, my team was very happy the day after the budget that I presented in 2003 when we got above the fold on the front page of the ROB, small business applauds budget. There's lots of political capital in the small business community. What we really, and this is not a plea to let's love big business. It's a plea to say what we really got to get our heads around is how do we grow businesses?
Yes.
How do we scale them up? How do we introduce them to markets that are outside their local areas and outside Canada, for that matter? Because all of the ones that do figure out that they've got to be highly productive in order to compete in those other markets.
Yeah. No, and I couldn't agree more. And this is one of the smart versus not so smart taxation things. I would argue in Canada we have a tax break not that's for keeping small businesses small, which is simply not a tax break we should have. There's a lot of mythology around small business, one being that Canada and Ontario is the home of small businesses. We have way more small businesses than the U.S. Totally false. Absolutely, totally false. We have the same percentage of small businesses as the U.S. has. Exactly the same. We do not have more of them. Why we think they're important is that our big businesses don't get as big as the U.S. Right? And that ends up having more greater percentage of employment in the small business sector. But it's not because we have more small businesses. It's because our businesses don't grow to the extent that they do in the U.S., which then begs the question, why don't they grow? And one reason that they don't grow is that we have an incentive to stay small and an incentive to break up into clusters of small businesses that don't earn more than $500,000 in pre-tax income, so that they get the small business break. So I would love it if we had more of a focus on how to get, exactly what you said, how to get businesses of whatever size growing. And one of the things we propose is that we take all the money we spend on giving a tax break to smallness and convert it into a tax rate for growth, whether it's a small company or a big company. And the easy way to do that is just to say whatever the difference between your income, net income, this year and last year is tax-free. That makes growth in the year of growth free, and that's a huge incentive. It's good for the government because it gives an incentive to grow, and the next year you'll pay taxes, on that higher level that you just got this year. But I think thinking about your question of how can we make sure that this is a growth-incented environment, not a status quo incented.
And the benefits then range across a whole series of things. As you say, it's not that we're disproportionately small business or that we have large businesses that are underrepresented as a percentage of our total enterprises. It's still small. It's like 0.1% of enterprises that have employees are in what Industry Canada calls the large business category.
Yep.
But that 1/10 does 2/3 of our R&D. It produces 60% of our exports. It hires more people. It pays them better wages. It does more in-company training. It does more corporate philanthropy than anything in the SME sector. So it's a pretty strong incentive to say that there are a whole range of policy objectives that are either benign or positive for Canada that come as a result of growing more large enterprises.
Yep.
So if we can unlock that door, a lot of good things flow from it.
Yep. And the only real difference in size structure of Canadian and U.S. business is that at last time I checked, our largest company would be the 76th largest company in America. We would have as many Fortune 500 companies as the U.S. if we incorporated them into proportionately to our size as the U.S. We'd even have proportionally as many Fortune 200 size companies, but we've got no Fortune 1 through 75 sized companies, and those are the companies that are America's leaders in all of the things that John just talked about. So doing things to prevent our companies from getting to global scale, not good policy, and it's just not a good policy to try and keep small businesses as small as they are. What do you think on innovation, John? I mean, it's kind of the big thing. No CEO that I've ever met is anti-innovation, right? They aren't. But our kind of track record on innovation in Canadian business is by whatever the indicators you can come up with, and of course they're imperfect. Patents is one, and we do not so very good on patenting, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. From now that you've got I know you used to hang out with these guys too, but now that on a more regular basis you are with these CEOs kind of all the time. What's your sense of how they're thinking about innovation? Do you see any things that would cause you to believe, this might be something that is holding back our innovation, something that we could be doing? From your current perspective, you'd have as good a perspective of any on looking across that swath of the large productive businesses in Canada.
Yeah, and as we were saying, the ones that are really in globally competitive marketplaces are going to be either as innovative as anybody else, or they will not survive. Innovative or dead. So it's a pretty binary choice.
Yep.
So I think a lot of work has been done on this. I think you have to go back to other panels like the Wilson panel and say, well, how are we doing on implementing some of the things that they were talking about, because they clearly said opening the door to some of the industries that are protected in one way or another in Canada is one of the keys to making sure that we drive a higher level of innovation competitiveness. Now, if you survey, the CEOs who are members of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, undoubtedly some of them would, and I think this is true of any business, if I have a business plan that is based on a certain regulatory environment, and you tell me you want to change that and make it more competitive, I'm not intuitively going to like that.
Right, yes.
So, but what most would say is, okay, that's fine. Just tell me where you want to go. Give me some time to adjust to the new reality, and then I'll sign on for it. Because, in principle, everybody agrees innovation is important, it's the right thing, and competition is a good thing. So I think that we've got some hard work to do in a number of sectors that have not had full open competition. And quite frankly, although governments have endorsed Red Wilson's report, a lot of stuff hasn't actually been done out of it. Yeah. And there are other reports and other studies as well that say many of the same things.
Yeah. No, and Tom, and the magnificent Tom Jenkins is a member of our task force panel, and he's certainly a proponent of that, making sure we just open up everything that we can open up to make sure that gets driven.
And you've seen, I guess, the poster child for what you might call unilateral disarmament and things like that is New Zealand, where they've actually done extremely well as a result of really just saying, okay, we're small, but we're going to be an open economy. And you see it, for example, in one of our most protected sectors in agriculture, where we have a supply managed system that makes sure that farmers really don't have too much to worry about. They have to get up early in the morning. I grant that. But it's not hard to make money if you've got a dairy farm in Canada. Meanwhile, Canadian consumption of dairy products has actually not changed in decades. It's remained flat. In fact, in most developed countries, it's remained flat. In Asia, consumption of dairy products is going up sharply per capita. Well, who's supplying that? New Zealand.
Yes.
A country the size of Toronto.
Right, yes.
Has over 30% of the world dairy exports. Because they laid down their arms and opened up their market. Whereas Canada, which has apparently a very prosperous dairy sector, exports nothing.
Nothing, yeah. That chart of this sort of breadbasket of a country continuing to have a greater and greater food deficit is crazy.
How are we going to feed 10 billion people? If countries like Canada have what kindly could be referred to as a Soviet-style central planning system for key agricultural components.
No, it's true.
We feed ourselves very well.
Yes.
Now, the fact that low-income Canadians pay the equivalent of 250% tariffs on a piece of cheese, some people, both on the left and on the right of the political spectrum, might say, that doesn't seem like a very good policy. But if you want to get a unanimous resolution in the House of Commons, even the fractious one we've got now,
good luck.
Put it on supply management. Everybody's for it.
Everybody's for it.
So that's one example of the kinds of things that we could be doing when we pat ourselves on the back about how we've done in some areas, but we are willfully blind about some others. When I go around, I spend a lot of my time talking to the CEOs. What's on your mind? What keeps you awake at night? One of them that is repeatedly a theme is talent. I spend my time, how am I going to get the talent? I know that and when you look at some of the things that have come out recently, you've got to say we should start worrying about that. Just in October, the OECD released a very comprehensive study of numeracy and literacy skills across OECD countries. How did Canada perform?
That was not pleasant.
No, are we satisfied with being below average? Now, like your marginal tax rate comparison, like our conversation on our healthcare system, this is going to be the same. We're going to say, actually, compared to guess who, we're not doing too badly.
Yeah.
Compared to the United States, we look all right.
Yeah.
But compared to the rest of the world, we should be panicking about it. Our scores in literacy and numeracy are at a crisis level, in my view, if we think we should be better than below average.
Yeah. And it brings up, I think, one important thing that I wish that we try to do a lot of, and I think more is better on it, is just this notion of having real international benchmarks, right? On a bunch of these things, like I don't think unless you had that kind of a report, the average Canadian, anybody would say, yeah, I'm pretty sure our numeracy and literacy is kind of doing badly because you're swimming in that water and it looks the way it has, and it's only when you look at that you start to say, wow, that's the case. I mean, we did a piece that one of the best things we've done as a task force is look at graduate education in Canada versus the U.S. And nobody had ever crunched the numbers, and it turns out, in Ontario we graduate as many proportionally from undergrad as our U.S. peers, and we found that then at the graduate level we graduate half. And actually, all the folks in the Ontario government, as soon as they saw that, they said, well, that's no good. That's no good. But until the numbers were there, it was just, that our graduate education sector is this big, and we put this much money in it, and they put $700 million extra dollars into it to try and close that gap. And I think we have to do more of that. And I think probably, I'm sure you do some of this to it with your folks, but I think making sure that at a sectoral level, our big business sectors benchmark themselves and say what is competitive in terms of innovation spending, training spending, all the things that make us more competitive. But I think more is better, and is one of the things that we are trying to do by comparing us to these jurisdictions.
Oh, I think the benchmarking is important. I think that we've got to have a well-informed investment public as well.
Yes.
Typically R&D expenditures fall under the SG&A category, and when they're discussed with investors, the issue is how do you control that spending?
Yeah.
It's not there's no reward for betting the farm on innovation.
Yeah.
There's a reward for this quarter's results achieving the target that the street is set for it. So I think this is a pressure where you've got a lot of public companies that are struggling to be competitive in an environment in which filing patents and doing R&D is really important. But that's one of those factors that tends to slow things down.
No, and this is a big worry of mine, John. I would argue that unquestionably from, let's just say, the end of World War II or 1950 or something to 1980 or 1990, the North American capital markets, I think, were a big advantage for North America. They were big, inefficient, and low transaction costs, and arguably kind of the best in the world. I mean, London was strong as well, but it was a real advantage. I'm increasingly worried that the way they function now here, they've turned from an advantage to a disadvantage. Yes, they have efficiency, but efficiency in what? In pounding the innovation out of their companies, and efficient in focusing on this quarter's earnings. And the more I work in the international kind of world. I've been doing a bunch of work in Denmark now, and it's very interesting to see how different the capital markets and the corporate structures are there, and how I think it makes it more possible for the big international Danish companies to think more long term. Now, Denmark has its own challenges and problems too, but it's interesting as I travel around the world to see the contrast there and what was an advantage. I'm not so convinced is anymore, or at least it's at best kind of neutral.
Well, and I think what that says is there is room for corporate leadership
Yeah.
to actually take this issue in hand. And I mean, as dealing with markets, you have to explain what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And if they understand it, and that requires the ability to communicate and to explain where you want to go and what it will take to get there, and why you're doing what you're doing, then you can succeed.
Yeah.
But that requires, as it does in the political world, it requires leadership.
Yeah, and it requires a narrative that makes sense. Absolutely.
If only we could find two people to talk with substance and facts. This is a great conversation. What I'd like to do is open it up to the room. I'll have some people coming around with some mics, so if you can just put up your hand. There's a question here in the front. A couple questions.
Yeah, it's coming right behind you.
It's coming behind
that
you.
way everybody can hear you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you again for the Prosperity Institute for fabulous support. I've been coming to these, I think, for all 12 years. So
Thank you.
They keep on getting better and better. I have a two-pronged question. For Roger, there was an article you were quoted in a couple of weeks ago in the Report on Business where you propose a different talent model that could be used to be more competitive, where you bring in experts, and it wasn't quite a consulting model, but where you bring in different experts to come into organizations to kind of, I don't know if it was to leapfrog some of these issues, so you don't hire these people all the time in your organizations. You move them in and out. And I was wondering if you could maybe explain that in more detail of how this could help corporate Canada.
Sure.
And my question for John is, having been, for 4 years, I was a CEO of a trade association in the energy sector. What are your thoughts of infrastructure actually being built in Canada today?
Sure. Just quickly on that was Harvey Schachter writing about that HBR article that I mentioned. It's called "Rethinking the Decision Factory." It's an October HBR if you want to read it. And what I argue is that the world has gotten the business world has gotten much more white collar. There's a huge transition from proportion of the jobs being blue collar to proportion of the jobs being white collar, and we're managing white collar work the way we manage blue collar work, even though it's completely different. And as a result, we have incredibly bad productivity across North America for sure, and developed countries. Productivity growth in the white collar work world is about zero, and the way to improve it is to organize around projects, not around permanent tasks. So it's not so much bringing people in; it's organizing work more on a project basis. And I think it, and I've experimented with that, with Procter and Gamble, and the results are fabulous, and it could be applied more broadly. That was the argument there. John,
pipelines, we need them, and I think the whole issue around Keystone has demonstrated for Canadians is that we need to get our products to markets. I think there does tend to be a bit of an underappreciation within the broad mass of the Canadian public about what the family business really is. And it's not all energy. A lot of it is also natural resources. So we see a slide about Ring of Fire. And some of us find that friends and neighbors and family are a bit squeamish about that we dig stuff out of the ground and sell it to people. But that actually is how we pay the rent in this country. And that's why I say it's the family business. I think we've got a tremendous resource in the energy sector, but it's not going to be worth much to us if we don't find a way to get it to markets. And that requires that we do certain things. I think that, we have constitutional obligations with Aboriginal peoples that have to be respected. We want to have the highest possible controls on spills and leaks so that we get the best, the optimal results. But some of that is insufficient to persuade some people that we should do it anyway. That it doesn't matter how safe it is or how effective. I think that the energy world has changed in the last 5 years more than anyone could have ever anticipated, and that is putting pressure on the prices for Canadian products. that is costing us all in a whole range of ways. So I think for federal and provincial governments, it has to be a very high priority to get some of that capacity built, get our product to markets, and to do it in a reasonable period of time. Quite frankly, it's very hard for Ambassador Doer in Washington to be saying, Keystone's a really good idea, when the opponents can say, yeah, but you're not building pipelines in your own country. We can move the product on rail, and we've had some demonstrations of why that is not risk-free either. So we're not going to live in a carbon-free world for some time to come. Therefore, I think it's incumbent upon us to find the safest and best ways to get those products to market. So I think it's a very high priority.
I think we had another question just up here, and then I'll have one more in the back before we're able to go. Go ahead.
Again, thank you. Excellent present. This is a highlight of my year when I come and get these updates. Also a frustration because I don't see as much progress as I'd like to. On the innovation piece, you had the hardware, the software, and the telecommunications. Isn't the training piece huge? And have you looked at the difference in investment in training? Because I can have a fantastic piece of software and use 5% of it, like my brain. And if I could just train higher, I can really make a lot out of it.
We don't know the answer to that question. I think it's an important piece of the puzzle. We're just trying to peel that onion some more. That having said, I am utterly convinced at this point that systematic innovation training is absolutely critical across the economy. And one of the most enjoyable, rewarding, fun things we've done in the last year is we were funded by FedDev, Industry Canada, to teach 11 and 12-year-olds how to do systematic innovation. And I'm now convinced after that pilot this summer that it should be mandatory in K through 12 education. Not necessarily business innovation if they want to go and become a doctor, innovation if they want to go into the healthcare system or the nonprofit world or whatever. We should be the first jurisdiction on the planet that has mandatory innovation education, and we'll steal a huge march on our competitors. So the training part of it, I think, is really, really important.
I think we have time for one more question. Linda, I'll leave it to you at the back. No, sorry, Linda at the back.
Hi, I'm Jericho. I'm from Mass, and thank you very much. The report and your presentation was fantastic. My question is about the agricultural sector. We've heard for a number of years now that we need to do more with agriculture, and we've heard a lot of recommendations around increasing innovation, increasing the use of tools and technology, and just do more, figure out how to scale up. We've heard that over and over again, and the agricultural sector and the ministries involved haven't necessarily been able to budge the trend that much. And in fact, as you've shown us, the trade deficit has actually increased over the years. Can you comment on that a bit more? So what else do we need to do beyond just saying do more, the tools, the technology? What's that missing thing? When countries like the Netherlands, tiny little Netherlands, can be the #1 horticultural exporter in the world, what's Ontario doing wrong? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think John had part of the answer earlier, which is we've got to keep on opening our markets. I mean, for me, I come from an agricultural area, and I'm so chagrined about the way we've regulated this industry. Right? I'm not sort of completely opposed to some facets of supply management. But even if you wanted supply management, there's no way in the world any intelligent person would have let happen what's happened. Right? So how it is we've let the value of quota for an individual dairy farmer or a chicken farmer or an egg producer get to be by far and away the largest asset on their balance sheet is crazy, right? It's just insanity. That has nothing to do with the principles of supply management, even if you believe in the principles of supply management. And so what we should have done is we should have managed it like the Fed, right, manages inflation. We'd have said, here's our target price of egg quota, right, or milk quota, and it's this low value. And anytime we see quota trading at a higher level than that, we're going to dribble more quota out into the market to get prices back down. If prices go down to nothing, we will buy quota back in, just like the Fed manages interest rates. And we could have had quota for dairy farmers at a 5% or 10% of their total assets, rather than 80% of their total assets, and then they wouldn't drive with their tractors to Ottawa and protest anytime you try to open up markets at all. So it was just insanely senseless kind of management of the regulatory structure in that industry that's created this huge problem, which is we Canada, have produced an asset and encouraged people to invest in an asset that has no intrinsic value at all, and it's only regulatorily valued. And no wonder they go nuts when you say the thing that you paid for, that we created, the market that made you paid for, we're going to take it away from you. They go nuts. So I think we have to figure out a way. And again, John, I think gave another answer to that earlier, which I think is the clever political answer, which is you have to make the answer far down the line, but start moving towards it now. Because people won't go nuts then. People will go nuts if you say tomorrow we're changing everything. If you say 10 years from now it's going to be phased out. And on a bunch of supply management oriented things, we should be doing that, and that will help it.
An example of how this impacts the innovation question in the food processing sector, I probably shouldn't name names, but I have members in that business. One does a lot of processing in dairy, and in Canada does so only for the Canadian market. They also supply Asia out of Argentina because they're in the dairy sector. About 85% of their costs is the cost of raw milk. Well, that's twice as much in Canada as it is outside Canada. So you can't possibly make something in Canada to sell outside the Canadian market. You just can't do it. It's just not competitive. So we're driving that innovation literally out of the country in the supply managed segments. I'd argue that in grains and others that are not supply managed, we're as innovative as anybody. We've got results to show for it.
Yeah. And where are they probably going to build mammoth scale too? Argentina, I bet. Yeah. I bet the biggest. So they'll look at their factories, and they're going to be small scale in Canada and gigantic in Argentina, and they're Canadian. Yeah. They're a Canadian company. Yeah. No, it's tragic.
I get the feeling we could stay here all day and solve all the world's problems, but I am living by the Rotman tradition of ending on time. So first of all, I'd like to thank John for coming here this morning. I know he has a speech.
Thank you.
An opportunity speaking later today as well, so if you don't have lunch plans, you can track him down also in downtown Toronto. And if you enjoyed today, then please pay attention to what we're doing going forward. We have plans of looking at the impact of scale of business, at the impact of public sector pensions, private sector, public sector compensation, and we're turning our attention to healthcare for the first time in the coming months. So with that, thank you very much, and enjoy your day.